Good morning, everybody. Aiki Aikui. Say hello in Yurok and Karuk. As I'm waiting for my first slide to come up here, I am a Karuk descendant with half-siblings that are Yurok tribal members raised here in northwestern California. And a lot of my research as a federal research scientist with the Pacific Southwest Research Station is definitely influenced by my upbringing and being raised here in northwest California amongst the Hūpā, Yurok, and Karuk, but primarily the tribes of the Klamath River area. And with that, I got into fire and fuels management, and now more climate change and community forestry, particularly working with Indigenous people around my work with these communities, but it's broadening out more. So thank you to the prior speakers. It was a good setup. You heard about Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. A subset of that is traditional fire knowledge, as fire-related knowledge, beliefs, and practices developed by longtime inhabitants. And really an important aspect of this is having an intergenerational teaching. So even as I work cooperatively with the tribes and watershed councils and the Nature Conservancy to do the Klamath River treks, training exchange burn here on my property, was having my son as a Karuk descendant, and again with family who's more tribal in the area, about managing and stewarding using fire. An element of this are the factors of that, which are essentially some of the elements related to Indigenous fire stewardship, which definitely cover geology, topography, and soils, and a variety of different soil types here, particularly in the Klamath Mountains, very complex geology and topography. That affects the vegetation as combustible material or fuels. Another element of that is carbon that we're also looking at for our research. Knowledge of weather, particularly in some of the traditional teachings around the different types of weather and what that brings. And that's been an element of understanding the local or traditional knowledge around fire and weather that definitely affects fire behavior. And with that, fire operations from more of an Indigenous traditional sense that relate to fire effects on valued or desired resources, which I'll talk more about later. And then understanding there's also different structures to fire governance, whether it's the kind of colonial settler fire governance now often handled by the federal government and state, but also looking at the Indigenous fire governance that was between the villages and families and the community there historically, but also has some application today. So Indigenous knowledge guides fire stewardship within fire-prone ecosystems for fire-dependent cultures. And at the core of this is a traditional belief that fire is medicine. And essentially, when we have fire exclusion and fire suppression, which affects a lot of the wildland-urban interface today, which were villages historically, but now towns, is that aspect of not having fire prescribed in the right amount, the land and people can be sick, or in the cases we see now because of a century of the removal of Indigenous people's stewardship around fire and fire exclusion and fire suppression, densification of forest, increased fire risk, we're now having like a catastrophic overdose. And so there's some balance to that. And often a lot of Indigenous teachings are around fire, that fire is medicine, and there's balance to the application of that besides just lightning ignitions as a natural cause of fire. And that cultural burning is a form of human services for ecosystems. So much of the kind of the ecosystem service framework looks at what we can extract from nature, but a core to flipping that around of Indigenous beliefs is that we have human service and responsibility as part of that biocultural stewardship for ecosystems and those valued resources viewed as relations as part of our genealogy and creation accounts. And again, I'm talking from more on my traditional teachings, but also that's been taught to me as a scientist and working with these Indigenous communities. And it's through the evolution of that cultural fire regime that emerged from Indigenous adaptations forming fire-dependent cultures. And that's where I would say, over 80% of everything from basket material, utilitarian, foods, medicine, ceremonial, and regalia species are fire-dependent species, are some way are affected by fire in some aspect of their life history, and therefore the culture depends upon that as well. And the spatial and temporal extent of that fire really varies by ecosystem and habitats that are then linked to those fire-affected resources of value. Also, there's a diversity of knowledge. When we think about inclusivity and diversity, recognizing that different members of Indigenous community hold different types of knowledge and practice various types of cultural burning. That could be ritual, ceremonial, it could be more broadcast burning for multiple resources, but consider that diversity of knowledge when you seek that kind of fire traditional related knowledge. And also, when working with diverse communities, there may be similarities and differences between tribes or villages, groups such as clans or families, and then also amongst the leaders that look at the types of indigenous knowledge systems that would inform how you go about learning fire and fire effects from that tribal or indigenous perspective. One of the ways in which cultural fire regimes emerged is through the diversification of frequency, the specific application of fire for different values and objectives, often more frequent than lightened ignitions. The seasonality, definitely diversification of seasonal burning, even times outside of the regular fire lightning ignition season. Could be winter, cold, dry burns, early spring burns before, when it's linked to phenology, before the mating and breeding of the animals and birds, also before the emergence of bud break and the vulnerability of plant resources as your relations. And then with that, guiding that knowledge guides the specificity of when, where, and how you burn for those particular resources of interest. And at the core of this is, and I also saw this in with Mardu people in Western Australia when going there, was that there was responsibility, but that responsibility also ties to the complexity of that ecosystem, the various resources that are there, and the responsibility for fire use. And so it's just not that anybody went out and burned what they wanted. There was a lot of cultural structure and guidance around that responsible use of fire, and that's something that many tribes also want to see with their collaborations today, is that understanding of that. So for me as a scientist, how do we think about creating the best available science to inform research and affect policy? And so for my work, it's really learning what the indigenous community's researchable questions and science support needs are, picking culturally appropriate and scientifically appropriate our alignment with metrics and methods, also the importance of indicators, depending upon what scale we're looking at, bringing that indigenous knowledge into the analysis and findings that then guide, as having created that best available science, the management and policy aspect, and then really having the tribes or our local community be, as well as the society or the public, direct beneficiaries of that co-evolution and development of that work to inform management and stewardship. A way of framing this is to look at resources such as tangible and intangible elements of the environment and a scale from landscapes to even psychologically or how you feel within that site. Natural and cultural resources that are used to perpetuate customs, practices, and knowledge systems. So my slide messed up here a little bit somehow. Habitats or landscapes or places that support tribal ceremonies and subsistence. And they're also biophysically, such as a U.S. vegetation classification system, or culturally defined as far as a gathering site or other areas of ritual, sacred, or also cultural importance. And if you look at my little picture here, you can have fire that affects this habitat of Douglas fir, tan oak, and huckleberry, along with the mushrooms, and you have fire effects there on the trees, the soil that affects the mycorrhizal relationship with the mushrooms as an indicator that connects to the huckleberries that then connect to the oaks. And so you might have these multiple resources in this habitat, and a fire affects them, as well as the cultural uses at different times of season when you'd harvest those post-fire resources. I use various lines of evidence in interdisciplinary studies to examine. One point I want to add here is sometimes the media will say, oh, your research validates indigenous knowledge. It isn't to validate, but to co-create and produce that best available science using multiple methods, transdisciplinary aspects and studies together. When thinking about this, tiering kind of national authorities and programs to the local level for community forestry aspects of it, we think about landscape restoration strategies, the heterogeneity and resilience, strategically figuring out where we're going to plan our treatments, linking that with now climate vulnerability assessments, adaptation planning efforts to identify the threats and stressors, both in environment and community. And then here, particularly in the United States, we have the National Cohesive Strategy for Wildland Fire Management that has its three tenets of resilient landscapes, fire-adapted communities, which is preparing for wildfire but also living with fire, and for indigenous people having those fire-dependent cultural aspects integrated into that, and then our wildland fire management responses, both using prescribed fire or managing wildfire for resource objectives. And then linking that back to tribal and rural community values, often within the wildland-urban interface where people live and interact with the forest or these fire-prone ecosystems for the alignment of multiple resource objectives with those community values. My area of landscape here is just by the Oregon border within the Karuk Ancestor Territory. We have the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership across the Aboriginal territory. The Yurok are on the coast to the west by the Pacific Ocean. And within this area, we have 2 national forests which occupy over 95% of the federal land base. So as a non-reservation tribe, the Karuk tribe works within its ancestral territory with collaborators and partners to develop best available science and to affect their strategies for cultural stewardship. At the core of these are the wildland and urban interface values, so protection of life, property, and resources from undesired wildfires, looking at sociocultural well-being and local economic factors or security. A core of this is traditional foods and food sovereignty, looking at tribal value resources, often managed with fire, increase in access to be able to harvest those, and then actually using that indigenous knowledge to inform prescriptions and then the stewardship and management with the collaboratives, and also the work being done by the tribe very much so through master stewardship agreements to increase the quantity and quality of those valued resources. And then we have to think about that across this gradient. As we have manuals of chainsaw thinning and other cultural stewardship practices or mechanical thinning such as logging to retain those drought-tolerant, fire-adapted tree species that are often of high value. Patch and pile broadcast burning to reduce those fuels. Managing wildfire for resource objectives. Sometimes in a need to suppress fire where required or desired when it threatens life and property. And now with some cases, because of land ownerships and jurisdictions, not having fire as a area of effect, but protected areas are even having longer fire return intervals where maybe that frequency historically was there, but now we've managed for longer fire return intervals. One of the important aspects that I want to think about here from a biocultural conservation perspective is these elders of trees and shrubs. So you see the big oak on the far right. That's at a sacred site, has high topographic and geological diversity. It has a high species-rich diversity. But this big oak would have never grown naturally unless there had been frequently burning, because that lower branch to the left, I can walk up that tree and get about 15 feet above where I'm in the picture. And this tree is on a landscape area of sacred, be able to view sacred sites. But if this area, having not been culturally burned in over 100 years, and now we have density of fuels around it, if the fire comes and rages through here, a high severity fire, we lose that ability of that tree to teach us how people were living with fire there and how we can live with fire in the past. The middle tree with the 2 big long trunks used to have a bunch of lower branches and had a much more fuller crown when this was a traditional oak orchard. And we also use the structure related to the functionality, and that's a legacy of cultural stewardship there that now has also been jeopardized because of fire exclusion and suppression. Or we have this old manzanita here, gnarled and somewhat affected by fire before it was shaded out and dead. But the food processing stone or the artifact that goes along with that also tells us tales of how that area was formerly managed and stewarded as well. And using all of these as teachers to learn with fire and our prescriptions of management and how to live with fire and manage it today. So just a synopsis here, in creating the best available science with tribes, have those as research partners, learn what the researchable questions are, develop and implement those national and regional strategies or initiatives, and then look at the different master stewardship agreements or other compacts to have the government relationship and honor that indigenous sovereignty. And then really from a community forestry perspective, having that local knowledge to inform the whole process of science development, but really, again, making change on the ground for biocultural conservation and perpetuating these knowledge systems and practices. Thank you.